The bell above the door at Rosie's diner hadn't stopped chiming since 5:30 that morning, and it was barely past 8 o'clock when the breakfast rush hit its peak. The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee filled every corner of the small establishment, mixing with the sound of forks scraping against plates and the constant murmur of conversation that never quite died down. Every booth was full, every stool at the counter occupied by regulars who'd been coming here for decades, their routines as predictable as the sunrise that now streamed through the front windows. The young waitress moved between tables with the kind of exhausted efficiency that comes from working double shifts 3 days in a row, her name tag slightly crooked, reading Sarah in faded letters that had seen better days. Her apron was stained with coffee and ketchup from the morning's battles, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that had given up any pretense of neatness hours ago. She was 24 years old and looked 30, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix because it came from somewhere deeper than just physical exhaustion. The diner was her third job this year, and if the tips didn't pick up soon, it would be her last chance before the eviction notice became something more than just a threat taped to her apartment door. She'd been in Millbrook for 6 months now, having fled from a situation back home that she didn't like to think about, and this small Pennsylvania town had become her refuge by default rather than choice. The regulars barely noticed her beyond their coffee refills and their eggs over easy, which was fine by her because being invisible meant being safe, and safe was all she needed right now. The diner itself was a relic from the 1950s that had somehow survived every economic downturn and chain restaurant invasion, its chrome fixtures dulled by decades of use, its red vinyl booths cracked and patched with duct tape that matched nothing. Rosie herself had been dead for 15 years, but her daughter Martha kept the place running out of stubbornness more than profit, paying minimum wage and expecting maximum effort from whoever was desperate enough to work there. Sarah balanced 3 plates of pancakes on one arm and 2 breakfast specials on the other, navigating the narrow aisle between tables with the precision of someone who'd learned that dropping food meant paying for it out of her own pocket. Table 7 wanted more syrup, Table 4 was complaining about their hash browns being too crispy, and Table 9 hadn't even looked at their menus yet, despite sitting there for 10 minutes. She plastered on the smile that didn't reach her eyes, the one she'd perfected over years of service industry jobs, and delivered the plates to Table 6 where a family of 4 sat arguing about whether they'd take the scenic route or the highway after breakfast. Nobody said thank you, which was normal, and nobody made eye contact, which was also normal, and she collected their empty creamer cups and moved on to the next crisis, because that's what the job required. The cook was shouting something from the kitchen about running low on egg, which was impossible because they'd just gotten a delivery yesterday, but Martha was too busy arguing with a supplier on the phone to deal with it, which meant Sarah would have to start telling customers that the omelets were off the menu until further notice. She could already predict the complaints, the angry faces, the reduced tips, the way this would somehow become her fault even though she had nothing to do with inventory. Her feet ached in the cheap sneakers she'd bought from the discount store, her back screamed from the constant bending and lifting, and her wrists throbbed from carrying heavy trays for hours on end. But she kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering why she'd ended up here in the first place. Sarah balanced 3 plates of pancakes on one arm and 2 breakfast specials on the other, navigating the narrow aisle between tables with the precision of someone who'd learned that dropping food meant paying for it out of her own pocket. Table 7 wanted more syrup, Table 4 was complaining about their hash browns being too crispy, and Table 9 hadn't even looked at their menus yet, despite sitting there for 10 minutes. She plastered on the smile that didn't reach her eyes, the one she'd perfected over years of service industry jobs, and delivered the plates to Table 6 where a family of 4 sat arguing about whether they'd take the scenic route or the highway after breakfast. Nobody said thank you, which was normal, and nobody made eye contact, which was also normal, and she collected their empty creamer cups and moved on to the next crisis, because that's what the job required. The cook was shouting something from the kitchen about running low on eggs, which was impossible because they'd just gotten a delivery yesterday, but Martha was too busy arguing with a supplier on the phone to deal with it, which meant Sarah would have to start telling customers that the omelets were off the menu until further notice. She could already predict the complaints, the angry faces, the reduced tips, the way this would somehow become her fault even though she had nothing to do with inventory, Her feet ached in the cheap sneakers she'd bought from the discount store, her back screamed from the constant bending and lifting, and her wrists throbbed from carrying heavy trays for hours on end. But she kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering why she'd ended up here in the first place. The bell chimed again at 8:15 and Sarah glanced up out of habit to see who was coming in, already calculating whether she had the energy to greet another customer with false enthusiasm. The man who entered was different from the usual crowd. That much was immediately obvious, and in a town like Millbrook where everyone knew everyone else's business, different meant interesting, which meant gossip, which meant trouble. He was somewhere in his 70s, maybe older, with silver hair that was professionally styled in a way that nobody in this town bothered with, wearing slacks and a button-down shirt that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. His shoes were polished leather, not the scuffed work boots or worn sneakers that most customers wore, and he carried himself with a kind of careful dignity that suggested he wasn't used to places like this, but was making an effort not to show it. He paused just inside the doorway, surveying the crowded diner with an expression that was hard to read, something between determination and anxiety, his hands trembling slightly at his sides in a way that could have been age or nervousness or something else entirely. Sarah watched as he made his way to the only empty booth, the one in the far corner near the window that most people avoided because it was too far from the bathrooms and too close to the kitchen noise, but he seemed to prefer the isolation. He sat down slowly, carefully, arranging himself in the booth like someone who'd thought about this moment for a while, and when he picked up the laminated menu, his hands shook enough that the plastic rattled softly against the table. The other waitress, Karen, was supposed to take that section, but she was in the back complaining about her ex-husband to Martha, which meant Sarah would have to cover it, which meant adding another 4 tables to her already impossible workload. She grabbed a coffee pot and a water glass and headed over, her smile already in place, her greeting already forming in her mouth, the same words she'd said 1,000 times before to 1,000 different faces. But when she reached the table and opened her mouth to ask what he'd like to drink, the man looked up at her with an expression of such desperate frustration that the words died in her throat. He was trying to speak, his mouth opening and closing, sounds emerging that weren't quite words, his face reddening with the effort of trying to force his brain and his mouth to cooperate. It wasn't a stutter exactly, nothing so simple as repeated consonants or stretched vowels, but something more fundamental, a complete disconnect between intention and execution, that left him gasping and grimacing with the exertion. Sarah had seen enough in her life to recognize when someone was struggling with something beyond their control, had experienced enough judgment and cruelty to know that the worst thing she could do right now was make this man feel worse than he already did. So instead of doing what most people would do, instead of finishing his sentences or looking away in embarrassment or calling someone else over to deal with it, she simply set down the coffee pot and pulled out her order pad and pen. "It's loud in here," she said, keeping her voice calm and matter-of-fact, not pitying, not condescending, just stating an observation. "Sometimes it's easier to write things down when there's too much noise. Would that help?" The relief that flooded across his face was immediate and overwhelming, his eyes actually welling up with tears that he blinked back quickly, his hand reaching for the pen she offered with a desperation that suggested he'd been bracing himself for mockery or impatience. He took the pen and pad with shaking hands and wrote in surprisingly elegant handwriting that spoke of a different era, when penmanship was taught as an art form rather than an afterthought. "Coffee, black, wheat toast, scrambled eggs, thank you." She read it and nodded, not making a big deal out of it, not calling attention to their exchange, just taking the order like she would from anyone else. "Coming right up," she said, and meant it, and when she walked away she could feel his eyes following her with an expression she couldn't quite name, but that stayed with her as she called his order through to the kitchen. The other customers hadn't noticed the interaction, too absorbed in their own meals and conversations, but Sarah felt something shift in her chest, some small recognition that this moment mattered in a way she couldn't explain yet. She'd spent so long trying to be invisible, trying not to connect with anyone or anything in this town, building walls around herself to stay safe from the kinds of people who'd hurt her before, but something about this man's vulnerability, his quiet dignity, in the face of obvious struggle, had cracked something open inside her that she'd thought was permanently sealed shut. The breakfast rush finally started to thin out around 9:30, the regulars heading off to their jobs or their retirement routines, leaving behind dirty plates and scattered tips that Sarah collected with mechanical efficiency. The man in the corner booth had finished his eggs and toast but hadn't left, sitting quietly with his coffee cup staring out the window at the main street of Millbrook, where the same trucks drove past in the same order they did every morning. Sarah noticed he'd left the notepad and pen on the table, not pushed aside but placed deliberately in the center, like an invitation or a question he didn't know how to ask. She'd been working non-stop for 4 hours and her body was screaming for a break, but Martha didn't believe in breaks during shift changes, so Sarah was stuck until the lunch waitress arrived at 11. She'd just finished clearing table 4, when she saw the man trying to get her attention, his hand raised slightly, that same frustrated expression on his face as he attempted to form words that wouldn't come. She grabbed the coffee pot and headed over, and when she reached the table he pointed to the notepad and then to the seat across from him, a clear invitation that violated every restaurant protocol but that somehow didn't feel inappropriate or threatening. "I'm not supposed to sit with customers," she said, but even as she spoke she was already sliding into the booth, exhausted enough that breaking the rules seemed less important than getting off her feet for 2 minutes. He picked up the pen and wrote quickly, his handwriting becoming more rushed and less elegant as he tried to keep up with his thoughts. "I have a speech disorder, aphasia, from a stroke. 3 months ago. You're the first person who didn't treat me like I'm stupid." Sarah read the words and felt something twist in her chest, some combination of anger at the world and recognition of shared experience. "People are idiots," she said bluntly, pouring herself half a cup of coffee, even though she wasn't supposed to drink on shift. "They think if you can't talk normal, you can't think normal. I had a friend once who was deaf. People would shout at her like volume was the problem." He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his whole face, and wrote again, "What's your name? I'm here every day this week. Would like someone to talk to, or write to." She hesitated because giving her name meant becoming visible, meant creating a connection, meant opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt or disappointed or let down the way she'd been let down before. But something about this man felt safe in a way she couldn't articulate, some quality of shared outsider status, of knowing what it felt like to be dismissed and overlooked and treated as less than human. "Sarah," she said finally, "and yeah, okay, I'm here most mornings. Breakfast shift, 6 to 2. He wrote his response quickly, underlining certain words for emphasis. "I'm staying at the Hamilton Inn, visiting, business. We'll see you tomorrow." She nodded and stood up, suddenly aware that Karen was watching from across the diner with an expression of suspicious curiosity that meant this would be all over town by lunchtime. Let them talk, Sarah thought, surprising herself with the defiance of let them make up whatever stories they wanted. She'd survived worse than small-town gossip. The man left cash on the table when he departed 20 minutes later, and when Sarah collected it she found he'd tipped $40 on a $12 meal, but more than that he'd left a note on the pad. "Thank you for seeing me as human. It's been a long time. Tomorrow, same booth." She folded the note and put it in her apron pocket, and for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something like hope flicker to life in the dark spaces inside her chest. She didn't know who this man was or why he was in Millbrook or what his story might be, but she knew what it felt like to struggle with something invisible, to be judged for circumstances beyond your control, to need someone to simply acknowledge your humanity without conditions or expectation. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of dirty dishes and refilled coffee cups, but her mind kept returning to that conversation, to the way writing back and forth had felt like the most honest communication she'd had with another person in longer than she could remember. When she finally clocked out at 2, and walked back to her tiny apartment above the hardware store, she took out the note and read it again, and for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she didn't feel quite so alone. The next morning he was there when Sarah arrived for her shift at 6, sitting in the same booth, dressed in different clothes but with the same careful dignity, the same notepad already on the table waiting for their conversation to continue. She poured his coffee without asking, remembering he took it black, and he smiled that transformative smile and wrote "good memory" on the pad. They fell into a routine over the following days that felt both strange and completely natural, their written conversations happening in the stolen moments between her other tables. During the brief lulls when the breakfast rush ebbed and flowed, he wrote about his life in short bursts, fragments of information that Sarah pieced together like a puzzle. He'd been a professor once, teaching literature at a university, until the stroke had stolen his words and with them his career, his identity, everything he'd built over 40 years of academic life. His wife had died 2 years before the stroke, and his children were scattered across the country, successful and busy, and uncomfortable with their father's new limitations, visiting out of obligation, but never staying long enough to learn how to communicate with him, beyond stilted, shouted conversations that assumed volume could compensate for aphasia. He was in Millbrook because his lawyer had business here, something about settling an estate, and he'd extended his stay at the Hamilton Inn, because returning to his empty house in Philadelphia felt more lonely than being alone in a strange town where at least he could sit in a diner and write notes to a waitress who didn't pity him. Sarah shared less at first, her natural guardedness making her cautious with personal details, but gradually she found herself writing back in the margins of order tickets and on napkins, telling him things she hadn't told anyone. About the boyfriend back home who'd started as charming and ended as terrifying, about the restraining order that was just a piece of paper against someone who didn't care about consequence, about choosing Millbrook because it was small enough to notice strangers, but big enough that she could disappear into the working-class landscape of waitresses and factory workers and gas station attendants, about her student loans from the 2 years of college she'd completed before everything fell apart, about the nursing degree she'd been pursuing that now seemed like a fantasy from someone else's life, about working 3 jobs just to stay ahead of debt collectors and landlords and the constant fear of being found. He listened, or rather read, with the kind of focused attention that suggested he actually cared about her answers, not just waiting for his turn to talk, and his responses were thoughtful and encouraging without being patronizing. "You're smart," he wrote one morning. "Nursing's lot, but not too late. Never too late." She'd laughed at that, bitter and disbelieving, but the words had stayed with her through her shift and into the night, repeating themselves like a mantra she didn't quite believe but wanted to. By the end of the first week, the other regulars had noticed their unusual friendship, the way Sarah would slide into his booth for 2 or 3 minutes at a time, the way they communicated entirely through written notes, the way his face lit up when she appeared with the coffee pot. Karen made snide comments about Sarah having a sugar daddy, which was ignorant and cruel but also par for the course for Karen, who'd never met a kind thought she couldn't smother with gossip. Martha didn't say anything but watched with narrowed eyes, clearly weighing whether this violated some policy she should enforce but couldn't quite articulate. The customers mostly ignored it, too wrapped up in their own routines to care about the quiet man in the corner and the tired waitress who'd found an unexpected connection. Sarah stopped caring what they thought sometime around day 3, when she realized that these morning conversations had become the best part of her day, the only time she felt like herself instead of just a collection of survival mechanisms and defensive behavior. They talked about books he'd taught and she'd read, about the difference between classics and literature, about whether happy endings were realistic or just wishful thinking. They argued in writing about politics and religion and whether small towns were dying or just changing, their notes becoming more passionate and detailed as they learned each other's communication rhythms. He had opinions that were informed and nuanced without being condescending, and he challenged her assumptions without dismissing her experiences, treating her like an intellectual equal despite the 30-year age gap and the vast difference in their educational background. For the first time since leaving home, Sarah felt seen as something more than just a waitress or a victim or a cautionary tale, and the feeling was so powerful and so unfamiliar that it scared her almost as much as it thrilled. On the 9th morning he arrived later than usual, almost 7:30, and Sarah had started to worry that something had happened, that he'd checked out of the Hamilton Inn without warning, that this fragile connection they'd built would evaporate as suddenly as it had formed. But then the bell chimed and he walked in looking tired and older somehow, his movements less certain, his hands shaking more noticeably as he made his way to their booth. She brought coffee immediately and slid into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation, her concern overriding protocol. "You okay?" she mouthed, and he nodded, but then shook his head, contradiction written across his face. He picked up the pen and wrote for a long time, filling 3 full pages with his elegant handwriting that had become familiar to her, occasionally crossing out words and starting sentences over when his thoughts thought ahead of his hand. Sarah waited patiently, sipping her coffee and glancing occasionally at the other tables to make sure no one needed immediate attention, but mostly just watching his face as he wrote, seeing the concentration and the frustration, and something else that looked like determination or maybe resignation. When he finally pushed the notepad across the table, she read it slowly, her eyes widening as the full meaning of his words became clear. I've been thinking about what to do with my life now that teaching is gone, about what matters, about legacy. I have money, saved over 40 years, pension, life insurance from my wife, no one to leave it to really. Kids are fine, don't need it, barely visit, been watching you all week, you're smart, trapped, capable of so much more than this, have a proposition, business proposal, would you hear me out? Sarah's first instinct was suspicion because nothing in her life had prepared her for unexpected generosity without strings attached, and her experience with men making propositions had taught her that kindness always came with a price. Her hand instinctively went to her apron pocket where she kept the small canister of pepper spray, a habit from her previous life that she couldn't shake. But when she looked up at his face, she saw only earnestness and a kind of nervous hope, like he was the one taking the risk here, like he was the one who might get hurt. What kind of proposal? She wrote back, her handwriting cramped and defensive compared to his flowing script. He wrote quickly now, the words spilling out like he'd been rehearsing this speech in his head for days. Pay for you to finish nursing school, all of it, tuition, books, living expenses, no strings, no repayment, just a gift, from someone who knows what it's like to have dreams derailed, from someone who has money sitting in accounts doing nothing while young people drown in debt and fear. I've spent the week researching programs. There's a good nursing school in Pittsburgh, 2 hours from here, 2-year program to get your RN, then BSN online if you want. Total cost about $60,000. I can write that check today. Sarah felt her throat close up, her eyes burning with tears she absolutely refused to let fall in the middle of the breakfast rush with Karen watching from the counter. This had to be a joke or a scam or some elaborate setup for something worse, because people didn't just offer to pay for strangers' educations, didn't just hand over life-changing amounts of money without expecting something in return. She'd learned young that every gift came with obligations, that kindness was just manipulation by another name, that trusting people led to disappointment at best and danger at worst. But even as her brain screamed warnings and raised red flags and told her to walk away, some deeper part of her recognized the sincerity in his expression, the genuine desire to help without controlling, to give without taking. Why, she wrote, her hand shaking, why me? You don't even know me. His response was immediate and unflinching, because you saw me as human when everyone else saw a broken old man, because you took time, you didn't have to make me feel less alone, because I can, and it would mean something. Because legacy isn't just about blood family, it's about making the world slightly better, in whatever small ways we can. Because watching you work yourself to exhaustion in this diner for minimum wage and no future, makes me angry at a world that wastes potential. Because my wife was a nurse and she would have loved you and told me to do this. Because why not you? Sarah read the words 3 times, her vision blurring, her carefully constructed walls crumbling under the weight of unexpected compassion. She thought about her apartment above the hardware store, about the eviction notice, about the 3 jobs and the constant exhaustion, about the nursing degree that haunted her dreams like a ghost of who she might have been. She thought about trust and risk and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, not everyone was out to hurt her. I need to think about it, she finally wrote, and he nodded immediately. No pressure, no disappointment, just patient understanding that this was a lot to process. Of course, take your time, I'm here all week. She stood up on shaking legs and went back to work, but her mind was spinning with possibilities and fears, and the terrifying question of what happens when someone offers you exactly what you need most in the world. Sarah didn't sleep that night, lying awake in her tiny apartment staring at the water-stained ceiling while her mind churned through every possible angle and outcome. She'd taken the notepad home with her, something he'd offered when she'd hesitated about leaving their conversation unfinished, and she read his proposal over and over, until the words lost meaning and became just shapes on them. Every instinct she'd developed over years of survival told her this was too good to be boo, that accepting help meant giving someone power over her, that opening herself up to hope was just setting herself up for a harder fall when everything inevitably collapsed. But another voice, quieter and less certain, whispered that maybe this was what a real chance looked like, that maybe not everyone operated from ulterior motives, that maybe she was so traumatized by her past that she couldn't recognize genuine kindness anymore. She spent hours on her laptop researching the nursing program he'd mentioned, finding it was real and accredited, and exactly what she would need to restart her career, the tuition matching his estimates almost exactly. She calculated her current trajectory, working 3 minimum wage jobs and barely staying afloat, versus accepting his offer and having a sham profession in 2 years. The difference so stark it made her dizzy. The restraining order against her ex would expire in 6 months, and she had no plan for what came after, no strategy beyond hoping he'd lost interest or moved on to terrorizing someone else. Nursing would give her mobility, the ability to work anywhere in the country, to build a real life instead of just surviving hand-to-mouth in a town where she had no connections and no future. The next morning she arrived at the diner early, before her shift started, and found him already in their booth, like he'd been waiting for her, like he'd known she would need to finish this conversation before she could function. She slid across from him without preamble, and wrote on a fresh page of the notepad, her handwriting sharp and defensive. "What do you get out of this? There has to be something. Nobody just gives away $60,000. He read her question and nodded slowly, like he'd expected this and had his answer prepared. "Peace," he wrote. "Purpose. The knowledge that something I did mattered after I'm gone. I'm 73 years old. Had a stroke that took my career. My wife is dead. My kids tolerate me out of obligation. I have more money than I'll ever spend and no one to spend it on. This gives my life meaning. Helping you isn't charity, it's selfish. It makes me feel useful. It gives me something to care about. If that's not enough, if you need me to want something in return, then I want progress reports, want to know you're succeeding, want to be able to tell myself I made a difference. That's all." Sarah sat with that for a long moment, testing the words for hidden meanings and finding only honesty. It made sense in a way, the idea that giving could be its own reward, that helping someone wasn't always about control or obligation but about fighting against the meaninglessness that came with age and loss. "I don't trust easily," she wrote, underlining the words twice. "Been hurt before. If I say yes and you change your mind or there are conditions I don't know about, it will destroy me. I need you to be absolutely sure." His response was immediate and emphatic, his handwriting pressing hard enough to nearly tear through the paper. "I'm sure. No condition. You never have to see me again after you start school if you don't want to. The money goes into an account in your name. You control it. I just pay the bills as they come. If you want a lawyer to draw up papers, I'll pay for that too. Whatever makes you feel safe." She felt something break open inside her chest, some last defense mechanism giving way under the weight of his sincerity. She thought about her mother, who'd always said Sarah would never amount to anything, about the boyfriend who'd told her she was worthless without him, about every person who'd ever made her feel small and powerless and trapped. And then she thought about standing in a hospital, wearing scrubs, actually helping people instead of just surviving, building a life that was hers instead of just hiding from the one she'd fled. "Okay," she wrote, her hand shaking so badly the letters were barely legible. "Yes, I'll do it, but I'm paying you back someday. Might take 20 years, but I'm paying you back." He smiled that transformative smile and shook his head, writing quickly, "Pay it forward instead. Help someone else when you can. That's all the repayment I want." The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and applications and planning that felt surreal even as Sarah was living it. He was true to his word in every detail, setting up an account with her name on it, wiring funds that appeared like magic, hiring a lawyer to draft documents that protected her interests without binding her to any obligations. He helped her research apartments near the Pittsburgh campus, places that were safe and affordable and close to the university, reviewing listings with her during their morning conversations and offering opinions without pushing. They talked through her fears about starting school at 24 when most students would be younger, about whether she could handle the academic rigor after being out of school for so long, about the practical logistics of moving and establishing herself in a new city. He was patient and encouraging without being dismissive, acknowledging that her concerns were valid while gently challenging the beliefs that held her back. Sarah gave her notice at the diner and her other 2 jobs, enduring Martha's disapproval and Karen's jealous suspicions about how exactly Sarah had come into this sudden fortune. She packed her few belongings into trash bags and cardboard boxes, surprised by how little she'd accumulated during her months in Millbrook, how her entire life fit into the trunk of her beat-up car. On her last morning at Rosie's diner, he was there in their booth, and they shared a final written conversation that felt like both an ending and a beginning. "Thank you doesn't cover it," she wrote, tears streaming down her face in front of all the breakfast regulars who'd never bothered to learn her name. "You saved my life. You gave me a future. I don't know how to repay that." His response was characteristically thoughtful and generous. "You don't repay it, you live it. You become the nurse you were meant to be. You help people. You refuse to let the world make you bitter and small. You remember that kindness exists even when everything else says it doesn't. That's enough. That's everything." They hugged awkwardly in the diner parking lot before she left, the first time they'd touched beyond passing notepads, and Sarah felt like she was saying goodbye to a father she'd never had, a mentor she didn't deserve, a friend who'd appeared exactly when she needed him most. He promised to visit once she was settled to see how she was doing, to maintain their connection even though the daily routine was ending. She drove to Pittsburgh with her possessions and her fears and a bank account that represented someone else's faith in her potential, moving into a small studio apartment near the campus that was clean and safe and entirely hers. Registration was terrifying, walking into the nursing building surrounded by confident young students who seemed to belong there in ways she didn't, but she thought about their morning conversations and his insistence that she was capable of this, and she forced herself to keep moving forward. The first semester was brutal, relearning how to study and take notes and manage her time, adjusting to being in a classroom after years in the service industry, fighting imposter syndrome every single day. She sent him progress reports through email because he'd given her his address, short notes about her classes and her grades and the small victories that felt enormous to her. He always responded within hours, encouraging and proud, asking questions that showed he was paying attention, sharing stories about his own teaching days that made her laugh. She made friends slowly, other nursing students who were older or returning to school, forming study groups and support networks that reminded her what community felt like. She worked part-time at a campus coffee shop, earning her own money even though she didn't need to, maintaining some independence even as she accepted his help. Her grades were good, better than good, and each passing test and completed clinical rotation proved to herself that she could do this, that she wasn't the worthless failure her previous life had tried to convince her she was. By the end of the first year she'd made the dean's list, and she called him from the hallway outside her apartment, her first phone call to him, wanting to share the news in real time even though his aphasia made phone conversations difficult. 2 years later, Sarah stood in a hospital auditorium, wearing crisp new scrubs and a white coat that still smelled like the packaging it came in, surrounded by her classmates, who'd become her friends and her chosen family. The pinning ceremony was a tradition in nursing schools, the moment when new graduates officially became registered nurses, and Sarah's hands shook as she waited for her name to be called. She'd invited him months ago, not sure if he'd make the trip from Philadelphia, but when she scanned the audience she found him in the third row, silver hair unmistakable, wearing a suit for the occasion and smiling with obvious pride. Her name was called and she walked across the stage, accepting her pin and her diploma, shaking hands with administrators, who had no idea how far she'd traveled to reach this moment. The ceremony ended with the Nightingale Pledge, all the new nurses reciting the words together, promising to practice their profession faithfully and to devote themselves to the welfare of those committed to their care. Sarah's voice caught on the words, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this moment meant, how impossible it had seemed just 2 years ago, when she'd been an exhausted waitress with no hope and no future. After the ceremony she found him waiting outside the auditorium, and they didn't need notepads anymore because some things could be communicated without words. They hugged for a long time and Sarah let herself cry, all the fear and gratitude and disbelief pouring out of her in great heaving sobs that left her gasping. "You did this," he wrote on a small notepad he'd brought, "because old habits died hard. I just paid tuition. You did everything else. You studied. You passed. You earned this. Be proud." She introduced him to her friends, explaining to their curious questions that he was family, chosen family, the person who'd given her a chance when she'd needed it most. They went to dinner at a nice restaurant, celebrating with other nursing graduates and their families, and Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere for the first time in her adult life. She'd already accepted a job at a children's hospital in Philadelphia, starting in 2 weeks, which meant she'd be in the same city as him, which meant their friendship could continue beyond emails and occasional visits. He'd written her a letter that morning, delivered to her apartment before the ceremony.